August 16, 1977. Elvis Presley died with less than $1 million in the bank. The man who'd been the highest-paid entertainer in the world for 2 decades died nearly broke. Within hours of his death, before his body was even moved from Graceland, his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, made his first phone call. Not to Elvis's family, not to offer condolences. He called RCA Records to make sure they'd still honor their contracts. The Colonel took 50% of everything Elvis earned. 50%. The industry standard was 10 to 15, but here's what most people don't know. The Colonel wasn't even American. He was an illegal immigrant named Andreas Van Kuijk, who entered the country in 1929 and spent his entire life hiding that secret. He couldn't let Elvis tour internationally because he couldn't leave the United States without being deported. So Elvis, the biggest star in the world, never performed outside North America. Not once. This isn't a story about drugs or excess or rock and roll tragedy. This is a story about how one man sold another man's identity for profit and how that transaction slowly erased the person underneath. What happened to Elvis Presley can happen to anyone who loses control of their own story. Let's find out how. Before we go further, quick question. If someone offered you everything you ever wanted, but you had to give them 50% of your income and total control over your career for the rest of your life, would you take that deal? Elvis did. And by the time he realized what he'd traded away, it was too late to get it back. Stay with me because this story gets darker and more relevant to your own life than you might think. Hit subscribe right now. This is The Man Behind the King. Let's start with a fundamental question that most people never consider. Who decided what Elvis Presley would become? Not who discovered him, not who recorded him, but who decided which version of Elvis Aaron Presley would be presented to the world? The answer is complex, but one name dominates that story: Colonel Tom Parker. And understanding Parker's methods reveals how deliberately the Elvis myth was constructed from the very beginning. Thomas Andrew Parker, who took the honorary title of Colonel despite never serving in the military, was born Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk in Breda, Netherlands in 1899. He entered the United States illegally in 1929 and spent years working in carnivals, learning the art of attraction, manipulation, and showmanship. According to historical records and later investigations, Parker never became a United States citizen, a fact he concealed throughout his life, likely because he feared deportation if authorities discovered his illegal entry. This background is crucial because it shaped everything Parker did with Elvis. A carnival operator doesn't create authentic experiences. He creates illusions that separate people from their money. He understands that what people want isn't necessarily what's real, but what appears real. Parker brought this philosophy to artist management and revolutionized the industry in the process. When Parker first saw Elvis perform in 1955, historical accounts suggest he recognized something beyond raw talent. He saw malleability. Elvis Presley, at 20 years old, was a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, deeply attached to his mother Gladys, financially struggling and hungry for success. According to those who knew Elvis during this period, he was polite, deferential to authority, and eager to please. These weren't weaknesses, but in Parker's hands, these qualities became the foundation for total control. Parker negotiated Elvis's contract with RCA Victor Records in November 1955 for $35,000, which at the time was an unprecedented sum for a relatively unknown artist. This deal made headlines and immediately positioned Elvis as something special. But what's less discussed is how that deal structured future control. According to later legal investigations, Parker's management contracts with Elvis escalated from 25% commission in the 1950s to 50% by the 1970s. That 50% figure wasn't industry standard. The typical management commission ranged from 10 to 15%. Parker justified this extraordinary percentage by claiming Elvis was his only client and therefore deserved his full attention. But multiple sources, including testimony from Elvis's own associates, suggest Parker used that exclusivity as leverage for control rather than benefit. Elvis never had other advisors to question Parker's decisions. He never had competing voices offering different perspectives. Parker ensured he was the sole filter through which all professional information reached Elvis. This isolation was deliberate and strategic. Now let's talk about the image itself. The Elvis that America fell in love with in 1956 was carefully curated by the Colonel. According to interviews with photographers and journalists from that era, Parker maintained strict control over Elvis's public image. Photographers who captured Elvis smoking cigars or engaging in behavior that contradicted the clean living image were paid to suppress those photographs. Multiple sources confirm that the Colonel purchased and destroyed images that showed Elvis in ways that didn't align with the myth he was building. Think about what that means. Elvis couldn't smoke in public. He couldn't drink in public. He couldn't express political opinions. He couldn't date openly without scrutiny. Every aspect of his public life was filtered through the Colonel's vision of what would sell. And it worked brilliantly from a commercial standpoint. Elvis became the biggest star in the world, but from a human standpoint it created a prison. According to people close to Elvis, he enjoyed cigars privately, but couldn't smoke them where fans might see. He had complex thoughts about social issues, but was discouraged from expressing them publicly, because controversy might hurt record sales. He wanted to tour internationally, but Parker, who couldn't leave the United States due to his citizenship situation, blocked those opportunities. Layer by layer, the real Elvis Presley was buried beneath the manufactured icon. The myth required constant maintenance. Parker understood that Elvis's value wasn't in his authentic self, but in the fantasy he represented to millions of fans. Young women needed to believe Elvis was available and interested in them. Parents needed to believe Elvis was wholesome, despite his provocative performances. The industry needed to believe Elvis was controllable and professional. Each audience received a different version of the myth, carefully tailored to maintain maximum appeal. Historical records from Elvis's film career illustrate this clearly. Between 1956 and 1969, Elvis starred in 31 films. According to multiple sources, including Elvis's own later interviews, he initially hoped for serious acting roles. He admired actors like James Dean and Marlon Brando. He wanted to be taken seriously as a performer beyond music. But the Colonel negotiated film deals that prioritized financial guarantees over artistic quality. The contracts ensured Elvis would receive substantial payment and that Parker would receive his percentage, but they rarely included provisions for script approval or creative control. The result was a series of formulaic musical comedies that made enormous profits but failed to develop Elvis as a serious actor. When Elvis expressed frustration with these films, according to accounts from people in his inner circle, the Colonel reminded him of the financial benefits and the contractual obligations. Elvis learned that artistic fulfillment wasn't part of the arrangement. Commercial success was the only metric that mattered. This pattern repeated throughout Elvis's career. Every decision filtered through a single question: will this make money? Not, will this make Elvis happy? Not, will this fulfill his artistic potential? Not, will this allow him to grow as a person? Just, will this generate revenue? And because the myth was so profitable, the man beneath it became increasingly irrelevant. Here's something to consider. How many decisions in your own life are filtered through someone else's priorities? Your parents' expectations, your boss's demands, society's definition of success? When was the last time you made a major choice based purely on what you actually wanted, not what you thought you should want? By the mid-1960s, according to various accounts, Elvis had begun to feel disconnected from his own identity. The public Elvis, the movie star who sang cheerful songs on sunny beaches, bore little resemblance to the private Elvis, who struggled with the death of his mother, felt artistically stifled, and questioned his purpose. But expressing those private feelings publicly would damage the myth. So Elvis learned to compartmentalize, to separate the performance from the person, to maintain the illusion even as it consumed the reality. This compartmentalization, this split between public image and private self, would have profound psychological consequences. But those consequences didn't matter to the machine that had been built around Elvis Presley. The myth had become more important than the man. And once that threshold is crossed, there's rarely a way back. Living as a carefully constructed public image, rather than an authentic person, creates specific psychological pressures. For Elvis Presley, these pressures intensified throughout the 1960s. as the gap between his public persona and private reality widened. Understanding what that split cost him reveals something important about the human need for authenticity. According to people who spent time with Elvis during the 1960s, he increasingly expressed feelings of being trapped. Not trapped by fame in the abstract sense, but trapped by expectations that had calcified around him. The public expected certain behaviors, certain types of music, certain attitudes. Parker expected compliance with commercial decisions. The film studios expected him to show up, perform his songs, and not cause problems. Even his closest associates expected him to maintain the cheerful, generous persona that had defined his public image. Where in that structure was room for Elvis to simply be human, to have bad days, to express anger or frustration or doubt, to evolve beyond the 21-year-old sensation he'd been when the myth solidified? Multiple sources suggest there wasn't room. The myth required consistency, and humans aren't consistent. We grow, change, doubt, question. But Elvis couldn't afford those luxuries because too many people depended on the myth remaining stable. Think about your own life for a second. When was the last time you felt you couldn't show how you really felt because people needed you to be a certain way? Maybe at work, maybe with family, maybe online. That pressure to maintain a consistent image, even when you're falling apart inside, that's what Elvis lived with every single day for 2 decades. Let's talk specifically about the film career because it illustrates this pressure so clearly. By Elvis's own admission in later interviews, he found many of his films embarrassing. He called them travelogues and expressed frustration that he wasn't allowed to do dramatic roles. When the Beatles revolutionized popular music in the mid-1960s, Elvis was stuck in Hollywood making movies with titles like Girl Happy and Clambake that felt increasingly out of touch with the cultural moment. Imagine being recognized as one of the most important musicians of your generation, while being contractually obligated to perform songs you don't respect in films you find humiliating. According to accounts from people on those film sets, Elvis would sometimes apologize to crew members for the material. He knew it wasn't good. But he also knew that the Colonel had negotiated contracts requiring him to fulfill these obligations, and breaking those contracts would result in massive financial penalties that Elvis couldn't afford. So he showed up, did his job, and retreated further into his private world, where he could at least control something. That private world at Graceland became increasingly important to Elvis, precisely because it was one of the few spaces where performance wasn't required. According to former employees and members of Elvis's inner circle, he kept nocturnal hours, partly because nighttime offered privacy. During the day, tourists gathered outside Graceland's gates, reporters called, business demands intruded. But at night, Elvis could exist without performance. He could watch television, talk with friends, pursue hobbies without being Elvis Presley the icon. This nocturnal schedule, which we've explored in previous documentaries, served a psychological function beyond mere preference. It was an escape from the myth into something resembling normal life. Even that escape was limited, though, because Elvis surrounded himself with people on his payroll. The Memphis Mafia, as his entourage became known, were employees as much as friends. According to later accounts from several members, there was always awareness that contradicting Elvis or failing to maintain his mood might result in being fired. This created an environment where genuine honesty became difficult. When everyone around you depends on you financially, when disappointing you might cost them their livelihood, authentic feedback becomes rare. Multiple sources suggest Elvis was aware of this dynamic and troubled by it. He wanted real friendship, but had structured his life in ways that made real friendship nearly impossible. One particularly telling incident occurred in 1968. According to historical records, Elvis agreed to do a television special that was originally conceived as a Christmas program featuring Elvis singing carols in a tuxedo. Safe, predictable, consistent with the myth the Colonel had built. But director Steve Binder convinced Elvis to do something different, something raw and real. The result was the '68 comeback special, where Elvis performed in black leather, engaged directly with a small audience, and reconnected with the music that had made him famous. The special was a massive success, both critically and commercially. It reminded America why Elvis mattered, and according to people involved in the production, It reminded Elvis himself why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. The special represented a rare moment where authenticity broke through the manufactured image. But that moment was short-lived. The Colonel quickly reasserted control, steering Elvis toward a Las Vegas residency that would dominate the next phase of his career. The Vegas years, beginning in 1969, presented Elvis with a new version of the trap. According to the contract Parker negotiated with the International Hotel, Elvis would perform multiple shows per week for extended residencies. The contract was financially lucrative, but artistically limiting. Elvis performed the same setlist with minor variations, twice a night, sometimes 7 days a week. While the early Vegas shows demonstrated Elvis's continued power as a live performer, the relentless schedule took its toll. Multiple sources, including musicians who performed with Elvis, noted that the repetition drained the spontaneity and joy from the performances. It became a job, a well-paying job, but a job nonetheless. And here's where the human cost becomes clear. According to later investigations and testimony, Elvis struggled to maintain the grueling performance schedule. The physical and mental demands were unsustainable. He began experiencing health problems related to stress, exhaustion, and the pressure to perform night after night without adequate rest. This wasn't about seeking escape or recreation. According to multiple accounts, Elvis was trying desperately to meet the obligations Parker had committed him to, even when his body and mind needed rest. The cost of maintaining that performance, of being the icon rather than the person on demand, was his health, his peace of mind, and eventually his life. But the Colonel's commercial machine didn't slow down. According to financial records examined during the 1980s lawsuits, the Las Vegas residencies were enormously profitable for the casino and for the Colonel, whose gambling debts were reportedly forgiven as part of the arrangements. The person suffering the physical and psychological toll of endless performances was Elvis. But he was the least important part of the equation. The myth had to continue. The shows had to go on. The money had to flow. And if maintaining that required Elvis to sacrifice his health and well-being, that was apparently an acceptable cost. Think about the profound tragedy in that. Elvis Presley, one of the most talented and culturally significant artists of the 20th century, reduced to a function, a revenue-generating machine that had to be kept operational through increasingly desperate measures. The man had become invisible. Only the performance mattered. Here's something to think about. Elvis had everything: fame, money, talent, millions of fans, but he couldn't make his own decisions. He couldn't fire his manager. He couldn't choose his own songs. He couldn't even leave the country. Sometimes having everything means you've got nothing that's actually yours. The next chapter reveals how it all fell apart. Stay with me. This is The Man Behind the King. By the 1970s, according to multiple sources close to Elvis, he had become acutely aware of the gap between his public image and private reality. Several incidents from this period suggest Elvis actively sought ways to connect with something authentic, something beyond the manufactured myth that had defined his life for nearly 2 decades. One significant area where Elvis sought authentic connection was spiritual exploration. According to books written by members of his inner circle, including Larry Geller, who served as Elvis's hairstylist and spiritual advisor, Elvis became deeply interested in religious and philosophical texts during the 1960s and 70s. He read extensively about different spiritual traditions, from Christianity to Eastern philosophy. He asked profound questions about purpose, meaning, and identity. Multiple sources confirm that Elvis's spiritual seeking was genuine, not performative. He didn't publicize these interests because they didn't fit the image. The public Elvis was a simple entertainer, a good old boy from Memphis who sang pretty songs. The private Elvis was a man grappling with existential questions about who he was beyond the performance. This spiritual searching represented one of Elvis's attempts to locate an authentic self beneath the layers of manufactured identity. Another area where authenticity emerged was in Elvis's relationship with his daughter, Lisa Marie, born in 1968. According to accounts from Lisa Marie herself in later years, and from people who observed Elvis as a father, his relationship with his daughter represented one of the few spaces where he could simply be a person rather than an icon. With Lisa Marie, Elvis didn't have to perform. He could be silly, vulnerable, present. He could express love without calculation about how it would be perceived or commodified. Multiple sources suggest Elvis treasured these moments precisely because they allowed him to exist as something other than Elvis Presley, the product. But even fatherhood had limits as a refuge. Elvis's marriage to Priscilla Presley, Lisa Marie's mother, ended in divorce in 1973. According to various accounts, the pressures of Elvis's life, the constant performance, the difficulty in maintaining authentic intimacy when surrounded by employees and expectations contributed to the marriage's dissolution. Priscilla later described feeling like she was married to Elvis Presley, the myth rather than Elvis Presley the man. When she sought the man beneath the image, she found it increasingly difficult to locate him. This presents a heartbreaking paradox. Elvis sought authenticity in personal relationships, but the very structures that defined his life, the constant entourage, the performance expectations, the need to maintain the myth, made authentic relationships nearly impossible. The myth that had made him famous had also isolated him from genuine human connection. Have you ever felt lonely in a crowded room, surrounded by people but still completely alone because nobody really knows the real you? That was Elvis's entire adult life. Perhaps the most significant attempt Elvis made to reclaim authentic identity came through his music in the early 1970s. The album Elvis, That's the Way It Is from 1970 showcased Elvis returning to the music that mattered to him. Songs with emotional depth, performances with real feeling rather than the formulaic soundtracks that had dominated the 1960s. According to musicians who worked with Elvis during this period, these recording sessions revealed an artist still capable of extraordinary performances when given material worthy of his talent. But even these moments of authenticity faced constraints. The Colonel controlled which songs Elvis could record based on publishing agreements that benefited their shared financial interests. According to later legal investigations, the Colonel insisted that Elvis primarily record songs controlled by publishing companies where Parker had financial stakes. This meant that songs Elvis might have wanted to record, songs that might have represented his authentic artistic vision, were rejected if they didn't fit the financial structure the Colonel had created. Once again, commercial considerations overrode authentic expression. Let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed in Elvis documentaries: the concept of identity foreclosure. This is a psychological term describing what happens when someone's identity becomes fixed at a young age and they never develop beyond that fixed point. For Elvis Presley, his identity essentially froze around age 21 when he became massively famous. The public Elvis remained forever the young rebel, the sexy provocateur, the simple southern boy who loved his mama. Even as Elvis the person aged, experienced loss, developed new interests and perspectives, the myth demanded he remain consistent with that 21-year-old image. This created what psychologists might call a developmental crisis. Elvis couldn't grow up in public because growing up would damage the myth. He couldn't express the complexity, the doubts, the evolved thinking of a man in his 30s and 40s because the audience wanted the simple charm of the boy they'd fallen in love with. According to people who knew Elvis in his final years, he was acutely aware of this trap. He made comments about feeling like a prisoner of his own success, about wanting to be seen as more than just an entertainer, about wishing people could see the person rather than the image. But by the 1970s, the infrastructure built around the myth was too massive to dismantle. Thousands of people earned their living from Elvis Presley, the brand. The estate of Graceland required enormous upkeep. Parker's financial arrangements assumed continued revenue flow. The expectations of fans, of the industry, of everyone who depended on Elvis, demanded the performance continue. So even when Elvis sought authenticity, when he tried to connect with something real beyond the manufactured image, the machinery of fame pulled him back into performance. The myth was more powerful than the man had ever been. And the tragic irony is that this dynamic, this tension between authentic self and performed image, likely contributed to the behaviors that would ultimately end Elvis's life. When you can't be real in public, when every interaction demands performance, where do you find relief? According to multiple accounts, Elvis found it in pharmaceutical oblivion, in spaces where he didn't have to be anyone, where the performance could finally stop. By 1977, according to numerous accounts from people close to Elvis, the gap between the myth and the man had become unsustainable. The image America held of Elvis Presley bore almost no resemblance to the reality of who he had become, and maintaining that gap was destroying him physically and psychologically. Let's be very clear about something important. This isn't about judging Elvis Presley or diminishing his legacy. This is about understanding how the pressure to maintain an impossible image created a crisis that ultimately became fatal. According to medical examinations conducted after his death, Elvis was suffering from multiple serious health conditions by the mid-1970s. Chronic pain from old injuries, severe insomnia from years of irregular schedules, profound exhaustion from relentless touring and performing. His body was breaking down under the weight of decades of stress and impossible demands placed on him by the Colonel's relentless booking schedule. What makes this even more tragic is that, according to several sources, Elvis was aware something was wrong. He knew his health was deteriorating, but he also believed he couldn't stop. The performance requirements the Colonel had committed him to hadn't diminished. If anything, they had intensified. The Colonel had booked extensive tours. The financial obligations remained enormous. The machinery expected Elvis to show up and be the icon, regardless of how he actually felt. Multiple people in Elvis's life expressed concern during this period. According to later accounts, several members of the Memphis Mafia tried to intervene. Some were fired for their efforts. Red West and Sonny West, longtime members of Elvis's entourage, were let go in 1976, partly according to their own later statements, because they had tried to help Elvis and had confronted him about his deteriorating condition. Even concerned intervention was interpreted as disloyalty to the myth. The show had to go on. Nothing could interrupt the performance. Not health concerns, not friendship, not love. The myth demanded sacrifice, and Elvis was paying the price. Concert footage from Elvis's final tours reveals the physical toll. While Elvis could still deliver powerful performances, there were nights when he appeared exhausted, when his movements seemed labored, when the strain showed through the performance. Fans who attended these concerts later described feelings of concern, of witnessing something unsettling beneath the spectacle. But the tours continued. According to financial records, these final tours generated significant revenue. From a business standpoint, they were successful. From a human standpoint, they were destroying Elvis. And here's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole situation. According to later testimony and investigation, the Colonel knew about Elvis's condition. Multiple sources suggest the Colonel was aware his client was suffering, but the financial machine didn't stop. The tours continued to be booked. The performances continued to be scheduled. Because stopping would mean acknowledging that the myth was in crisis, and the myth was more valuable than the man. Think about what that means. The people who theoretically should have protected Elvis, his manager, the Colonel, the people closest to him, were all in some way complicit in maintaining a performance that was killing him. Not through malice necessarily, but through a shared investment in the myth that had made all of them wealthy and important. Elvis wasn't just a person anymore, he was an industry. And industries don't stop because one person is suffering. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died at Graceland. He was 42 years old. According to the official findings, his death resulted from cardiac arrhythmia, essentially heart failure. Medical examiners noted multiple contributing health factors that had developed over years of stress, exhaustion, and the relentless demands placed on his body. What happened next reveals just how completely the myth had overshadowed the man. According to historical accounts, when the Colonel was informed of Elvis's death, his immediate response was to call RCA Records to ensure they would continue to honor financial obligations. Before Elvis's body was even moved, the Colonel was thinking about contracts and revenue streams. The Colonel attended Elvis's funeral, but according to multiple witnesses, showed little emotional response. Several people who were present described his behavior as businesslike, as though Elvis's death was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a tragedy to be mourned. Within hours of Elvis's death, the Colonel was already planning how to continue profiting from the estate. This wasn't necessarily heartless in the conventional sense. The Colonel had spent 22 years building the Elvis myth. His entire identity was wrapped up in that myth just as much as Elvis's was. When Elvis died, the Colonel didn't mourn the man. He pivoted to protecting the image because the image was all that remained. And from a commercial standpoint, Parker's approach worked. Elvis became even more valuable dead than alive. According to financial analyses, Elvis's estate has generated billions of dollars since his death. The myth, freed from the limitations of the actual person, could be perfected and polished and sold indefinitely. But for Elvis himself, the man who had spent his adult life trapped inside that myth, there was no escape. The performance finally stopped on that August afternoon in Memphis, and the world mourned Elvis Presley the icon while barely knowing Elvis Presley the person. The tragedy isn't that Elvis died young. The tragedy is that Elvis disappeared long before his death. The man was erased gradually, systematically, by the very fame that was supposed to fulfill him. And once that erasure was complete, once the myth had fully consumed the person, the physical death was almost inevitable. So what does Elvis Presley's story teach us? Why does it matter decades after his death? Because the fundamental dynamic that destroyed Elvis, the tension between authentic self and performed image, is more relevant today than ever before. In our current era of social media, personal branding, and constant performance, millions of people experience a smaller version of what Elvis experienced on a grand scale. We curate versions of ourselves for different audiences. We maintain images that don't quite match our reality. We perform constantly, seeking validation through likes and shares and carefully crafted narratives. Elvis's story is a warning about what happens when that performance becomes more important than the person doing the performing. Let's start with the most basic lesson. Authenticity isn't optional. It's essential for psychological health. According to psychological research on identity and well-being, people who maintain significant gaps between their authentic selves and their public personas experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and emotional exhaustion. This isn't surprising. Performance requires energy. Constantly monitoring yourself, adjusting your behavior to meet external expectations, hiding aspects of yourself that don't fit the image, these activities are psychologically taxing. Elvis performed for 22 years straight. He could never stop being Elvis Presley the icon, even in private. According to multiple accounts, even at Graceland, surrounded by employees and associates, Elvis was performing to some degree. Only in very rare moments with a handful of people could he drop the mask. The psychological toll of that constant performance manifested in all the ways you might expect: insomnia, anxiety, difficulty trusting others, reliance on substances to manage the stress, eventually complete exhaustion. If you find yourself maintaining significantly different versions of yourself in different contexts, if you feel like people don't really know the real you, if you're exhausted from constant impression management, Elvis's story is a warning. That path leads somewhere dark. The second lesson relates to control and agency. Throughout his career, Elvis ceded control of major life decisions to the Colonel. The Colonel chose which songs Elvis recorded, which films he made, where he performed, how he was marketed. And while the Colonel's strategies made Elvis wealthy and famous, they also ensured Elvis never developed his own decision-making muscles. According to accounts from people who knew Elvis, he was often passive about major decisions. He'd go along with the Colonel's plans, even when he had reservations, because that's what he'd always done. This learned helplessness extended beyond professional decisions into personal ones. When Elvis wanted to fire the Colonel in the 1970s, he found himself trapped by the financial structures the Colonel had created. The Colonel demanded millions of dollars to release Elvis from their contracts. Elvis, despite being one of the most famous people in the world, felt powerless to change his own circumstances. The lesson here is about the danger of outsourcing major life decisions. It's tempting to let others make choices for us, especially when those others seem more knowledgeable or experienced. But every decision we delegate is a piece of agency we surrender. And if we surrender enough pieces, we wake up one day to discover we're living someone else's version of our life rather than our own. Hold on to your agency, make your own decisions, Even if you make mistakes, they're your mistakes to learn from. The third lesson concerns the people we surround ourselves with. Elvis lived surrounded by people on his payroll. The Memphis Mafia were employees as much as friends. This created a dynamic where honest feedback became rare. According to accounts from several members, contradicting Elvis or delivering unwelcome news risked being fired. So people learned to tell Elvis what he wanted to hear. They learned to maintain his mood rather than challenge his thinking. This left Elvis isolated, despite being constantly surrounded by people. He craved authentic connection, but had structured his life in ways that made authentic connection nearly impossible. The lesson is clear. Be very careful about financial relationships mixing with personal relationships. If the people closest to you depend on you financially, their ability to give you honest feedback becomes compromised. They may tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to hear. Seek out people in your life who have nothing to gain from flattering you, friends who aren't on your payroll, advisors who can afford to tell you uncomfortable truths, relationships where honesty is more valuable than harmony. The fourth lesson relates to success versus fulfillment. By any commercial measure, Elvis Presley was wildly successful. He sold hundreds of millions of records. He starred in dozens of films. He performed for millions of people. He became a global icon. But according to many accounts, Elvis wasn't fulfilled. The success brought wealth but not happiness, fame but not peace, recognition but not understanding. He achieved everything the world told him to want, yet found himself trapped and isolated. This disconnect between success and fulfillment is common. We pursue external markers of achievement, believing they'll bring internal satisfaction. But external success and internal fulfillment are different things. You can have one without the other. Elvis had extraordinary success, but struggled to find fulfillment because his success was built on hiding his authentic self rather than expressing it. The lesson is to question what success actually means to you, not what society says success should look like. Not what your parents or peers or industry believes constitutes success, but what would actually make you feel fulfilled. For Elvis, true fulfillment might have come from artistic expression, from genuine relationships, from spiritual growth, but he spent his life pursuing commercial success instead because that's what the machine demanded. Don't make that mistake. Define fulfillment on your own terms before chasing someone else's definition of success. The fifth lesson concerns identity and change. Elvis's identity froze around age 21. The public demanded he remain consistent with that young, rebellious, sexy image, even as he aged and evolved as a person. This created a developmental crisis where Elvis couldn't grow up in public. For most of us, identity isn't something that gets fixed. It evolves. We change over time as we have new experiences, gain new insights, face new challenges. That evolution is healthy and necessary. But if we're trapped in fixed images of who we're supposed to be, whether those images are imposed by others or by our own past choices, we can't develop. The lesson is to give yourself permission to evolve. You don't have to remain the person you were at 21 or 30 or 40. You can develop new interests, change your perspectives, become someone different from who you've been. Yes, this might confuse people who knew the old version of you. Yes, it might require uncomfortable conversations about how you've changed, but the alternative is remaining frozen in an outdated identity that no longer fits who you've become. Elvis never got that permission. His identity was owned by millions of fans who wanted him to remain fixed. Don't let that happen to you. Your identity belongs to you. Protect it. Elvis Presley was an extraordinary talent who changed music history. His impact cannot be diminished. But understanding the human cost of that impact matters. It matters because the pressure to perform, to maintain images, to live as brands rather than people hasn't gone away. If anything, it's gotten worse. So here's what I hope you take from this story. First, protect your authentic self. Don't trade who you are for who someone else needs you to be. Second, never give someone else total control over your life decisions. Elvis did that with the Colonel, and it cost him everything. Third, surround yourself with people who can be honest with you, even when it hurts. And finally, define success on your own terms. Elvis achieved everything the world told him to want and still felt empty inside. Before I let you go, ask yourself this. Are you living your life or performing someone else's version of it? If you're performing, what's one thing you could do today to be more genuinely yourself? Think about it. Share your thoughts in the comments if you want. This is the man behind the king. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking critically about these stories. If this documentary made you see fame differently, hit subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, the greatest tragedy isn't failing to become famous. It's losing yourself trying to become someone you're not. Elvis taught us that lesson. Don't waste it.